Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Dharmanaut Circle. It's nice to see familiar faces, a couple of new folks, maybe. And yeah, I realized I think we talked about Burning Man last year, and maybe it's kind of like, it's like a holiday. It's like with Chris, things like this, you happen once a month. If there's a holiday, you got to sort of talk about it. You got to tie your Dharma talk into like Christmas or maybe Easter, or maybe even Fourth of July, and so we kind of have to do it with Burning Man too. And it's such a fun year to talk a little bit about the burn or the non-burn or the wallow. I'm just going to assume that everybody has at least heard the somewhat disastrous weather conditions out there in the playa. But because there's something magical about Burning Man, and I would say there continues to be something magical about it, however much it's changed, that it's worth kind of meditating on the sort of symbolic register of the event. Um, and so it's kind of interesting to think about this. Sorry, there was somebody out there. To think about the symbolic registry of the event in light of this kind of weather. And it was kind of interesting that uh, even before the event began, there was kind of a news story. Some of you probably saw it, that there was a environmental protest on the road, I guess, to Gerlach, where some folks chained themselves up and blocked the road, and the cops came, and it turned out that there had been a policeman who had been killed in a chase within like a previous week in not that far away near Pyramid Lake. And so they were not in a messing around mood, and so they just plowed through the vehicle that had been blocking the road. And and I have a lot of respect for environmental activism. I completely understand young people being militantly motivated by the idea that the only thing of value is to disrupt the ongoing system in light of the terror that we have unleashed with climate change, et cetera. But it's still a little weak to hear someone go, "Oh, I'm no, don't do anything. We're just environmental activists. We don't have any weapons." And you're like, "Yeah, but this is cops." I mean, it's just there's like you don't, you shake the beehive. You're gonna get stuck. I mean, it's like I wish it was different, but like don't pretend like it's not that you're not shaking the beehive. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, but it was all very prophetic because, of course, though we can't really blame the hurricane and the attendant weather directly necessarily on climate change. Certainly, it seems to be part of a picture. We haven't had weather like this, I think, since the 1930s, and so it's extremely rare to have this kind of weather event in this part of the world at this time of the year. So there you have like this sort of unleashed mud fest. And one of the interesting things about the burn is that back in the 90s and into the early 2000s, there were a number of years that had some very rough weather. Some thunderstorms, but they were relatively brief. Some very cold nights sometimes. Some high wind whiteouts that went on for hours or sometimes days. Um, Not usually right at the event. There was usually sort of a little bit of a magic around the event where like the truly brutal stuff didn't quite happen. Like one year we stayed a day late because our RV broke, and then we managed to find an alternate. How the hell do you find an alternator in the middle of no? Anyway, we found an alternator because the alternator was busted. And we crammed it back in. Some guy knew how to do it. Da 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 da. We managed to get out, and then like literally within like an hour or two, there was like a 3-day whiteout that we wouldn't have been able to get out of, and it was kind of rough for people. They'd climbing around. They ran out of food. Da da da. So that threat was kind of there, and people were sort of ready for it. Like you kind of knew if you'd been there before, you were kind of up for it. And then there was just a long period of time where like the weather was pretty pleasant. So there were a lot of people, I think, who were not as aware of it. Last year it got kind of cold, I hear. I wasn't there. So it was just kind of odd, and I do hope that there's not too much undue suffering, but there's certainly going to be a lot of suffering, and is a lot of suffering, and yeah, so it's just sort of interesting to see, and it's interesting to watch even how the Schadenfreude of the media kind of responds to the event, and now that like we all can hate Burning Man because that's where like the rich Silicon Valley hedonists go. It sort of changes the whole way that the thing plays out in the sort of mass mind. And it's just so shocking to think about it because how far we've come or gone in a different direction than the 1990s when, yeah, everyone knew that they were being wasteful in burning huge amounts of kerosene. I mean, I saw some just extraordinary explosions that were useless. But the whole mode of the event was this kind of excess. And you might critique that for being excessive or whatever. But it was, it occurred at a certain moment in cultural development where the environmental cost of that particular thing was not seen to be overwhelmingly like an argument against it, because no one was really arguing against anything because they were just doing all this weird shit, including burning huge amount of kerosene to sort of break through whatever sense of cultural restraint people were working off by being out there. I'm not defending that or whatever, but it was just to observe how we go from there to this point where you can go look at the playa, and you have people who are like building green energy and solar energy things on the playa in order to make Burning Man carbon neutral. And I know one of the guys who is doing that, who's like a super smart physics guy and a nerd and acid head and whatever, and he's working like a large scale with lots of venture capital coming in, but it's used to try to make the event carbon neutral. And so just the way it was one of those, like, for me, like a visceral sense of how far the cultural imaginary has gone, and also just how excess, and I would argue also transgression, which was definitely part of the earlier Burning Man mode, just don't register the same way, and in fact are kind of almost the opposite in a way, in terms of how they manifest. And so, I think it's always interesting to pay attention to Burning Man as a kind of symbol or reflection of where what was counterculture has gone, how it has transformed, how it's been appropriated, how it's been abused, how it's been turned into other things. And of course, it's multiple events happening in multiple times, and it's impossible to kind of like generalize in some simplistic way of like, oh, now the tech bros own the space, so it's lame, or now everybody's taking pictures of themselves on Instagram, and that was the hard part for me, where it was like once there was like cell phones on the playa, and once you had a lot of people taking pictures and using them for their social media, that just for me just like made it a very, very different event, and kind of was like a bifurcation point. But other people have their own bifurcation points or their own sense of continuity, because there's still cool stuff going on. They're still doing stuff with people they've been going to for decades. It's impossible to kind of summarize it, but in that way, it's kind of like the world. So we pluck out what narratives are going to organize our sense of this kind of multi-leveled event. And I think the way in which not just climate crisis and immiseration of the physical in a way where suddenly so many of these people who are, over, in general, everyone is privileged just to be able to be there, but then some of them are uber privileged, are having to confront the kind of day-to-day misery that refugees have to encounter. is a weird resonance. And there's always been this weird dimension of Burning Man in the ways in which it kind of looks a little bit like a refugee camp, and people sort of both romanticize that and also develop skills that are actually good in those situations. And there were earlier iterations of the burn in 2005 when the Katrina went down. There were all these people. It happened during Burning Man. Everyone was like, we got to go. And so there was this whole movement of people who went down there with their skills, and this kind of moment that was, perhaps sort of naive in some ways, but also the kind of utopia, not even pragmatic expression that comes out of subcultural experiments that you hope would spill over into the real world. And so it was a real sign of that. And there were Burners Without Borders went on and did things and, tried to work in communities. And, I can't judge how well or badly that was or how naive it was, but it was a real thing and a real feeling. But this year was really kind of a different vibe. And it'll be really interesting to hear how people found light and pleasure and engagement within that situation, because adversity, of course, can draw us together in extraordinary ways. And certainly that was an adverse situation. So it's just kind of worthy of meditation. And what it brought up in my mind, thinking about the burn, I mean, there's so many different ways of thinking about whatever spirituality out there, consciousness out there, and its role in psychedelics in particular, and a kind of transhumanist, mystical, experiential invention. There's just so many different dimensions of it. But one of the things that I was thinking about, I mean, there's a lot of stories I could tell, but I'm not going to do that, was an opportunity that the playa and form that kind of plays into the meditational zone I want to explore tonight. And the opportunity was this, which is that going kind of away from the esplanade, the main area, or the sort of clock face, semicircular frontage of the playa, and going back farther and farther away from where people are camping. As you got farther and farther away, you could see the sort of arc of all of these lights and all of these moving vehicles, and you got farther and farther away. Because it's the desert, you could still hear things pretty well. And I would go out there, and when I was out there, it was always this marvelous kind of listening practice or hearing practice. And it would involve sort of hearing this chaos and then allowing the mind to open and spread to engage the totality of the noise, the incoherence, the randomness of all of these sonic figures that were harder to locate because they were far away, and yet there was still this tremendous diversity. There was drumming over here and dance beats over here and explosions over here and people screaming over there and multiple sound systems and cars moving by, and this just tremendous sort of environment of sound. And really experiencing and exploring how the mind can open up and embrace that kind of diversity. And in that context, not just doing it as kind of a fun trick, let's see if we can fit the whole playa in the mind, or we can take this highly chaotic set of sounds and sort of array ourselves so that they begin to talk to one another. It's almost like finding the hidden composition inside of the noise, which is a very interesting way to play. Something that I had learned meditating, years before that, where I would notice that there were certain states where, yes, it's pleasant in this case, I was meditating in the mountains, so the only sounds were the bells, and then there was birds and buzzing bees and the wind in the trees, and all these kind of pleasant sounds. A friend of mine calls, like, bird song and meditation is like crack. And it's just more, yes, give me more. Anyway, but the point being that, like, nonetheless, these sort of natural sounds have a kind of randomness to them, and if you're sitting and listening into a zone, but there were certain states I could get into, settled states, states of uh, mindfulness of present, of of the present, of the flow of the present, where these sort of random sounds would begin to compose something as if it was a piece, as if you're listening to a composition by a composer who happened to be using samples of nature sounds and was weaving them together into a kind of composition. Now, what is that difference? Like, well, we'll say, well, in the natural environment, there's just random sound. Like the bird is not coordinating with the wind in the trees beforehand to make some nice, beautiful array of sonic events. But at the same time, when you're listening to like a composer, particularly a modern composer, experimental music, and I'm not even talking about improvisation necessarily, it's not always clear that there's like, you can't really see the plan. It doesn't necessarily make sense the way that, the sonata form makes sense in classical music. So it partly is a quality of the mind that you're bringing to events. And it has been striking to me, one of the marvels of meditation has been these moments where experiences that have formerly seemed random begin to take on this quality of composition, in the sense that a music piece is composed. Or, for example, there's another time when I was looking at a bunch of bees buzzing around a bush. I don't remember what kind of bush it was, but had a lot of sweet flowers on it. It was at Green Gulch, and just in one kind of moment shift, it was all a dance, like really like a dance, like they were dancing like a collective dance. Like you go see Merce Cunningham and there's a dance. It's just all these bees, and it's a beautiful, subtle, and I think actually politically really rich shift, because it suggests that our experience of chaos as chaotic is not necessary or objective or factual. It's just kind of the way we tend to respond based on our own experience, based on the templates we bring to things. But that there is another level where we can appreciate the sense in the nonsense of noise or the nonsense of seemingly chaotic effects. And that developing that capacity, I think actually has a lot of richness to it. I mean, it's not something like you can just press a button and turn it on, at least in my case. But to have that experience of the composition of events that are seemingly random into some kind of deeper order does suggest a kind of, I don't know, faith in process, or a faith in not knowing, a faith in the chaos or the noise. It's the kind of faith that can put you into a group event where you can trust the crowd. Like I remember one time I was in a carnival in Trinidad, and it was fun, groovy. Oh wow! I've only seen Carnival a couple times. This is the real deal. Wow, it's so much fun. The sound system. Whoa, it's a lot of people. Oh my. Oh, oh shit. And there's this moment of like, am I gonna like not like, am I gonna lose control of what my body because there's so many people? And then you're just like, okay, whatever. I'm just gonna go with it. You trust it. You trust that there's some kind of pattern in the chaos, in the noise, and it's almost like you're listening for that thread that weaves all these things together to not the sound of the sound system, but a deeper kind of sound that can compose this space of chaos. And I think that that's possible in the kind of chaos we sometimes experience in our lives when things don't go the way we thought they would, or the car breaks down, or we get in an altercation, or we encounter a random situation, or we're on the subway and somebody starts freaking out, or like when the normal kind of breaks down, there's this sense of like, oh, this is chaos. This causes fear. I have to protect the self. I have to step away and regard. And you're like, well, sometimes you don't have that opportunity. Sometimes all you have is like the rain coming down, filling up your tent, the mud is everywhere, the porta potty's full. Well, it sucks. You got to like deal with that. And there's a kind of, I think there's a relationship between the kind of resilience that we can bring to chaos and the experiential quality of recognizing the sort of hidden composition of what was previously a chaotic situation. This is why I think it's actually a really important spiritual practice to listen to difficult music. Not all the time necessarily, if it's not like your great love, but even if you like mostly like other kinds of stuff, you should sometimes spend time with things that are chaotic or noisy or difficult or aggressive, and begin to sort of map ways of listening that allow you to enter into the space. So you're turning it into a practice. It's not about whether you enjoy it or not, or think it's good or not. Like that's fine. That's like music stuff, and we can play that. Like Greg was just talking about seeing John Zorn and doing Cobra, which is this insane, like improvisation, crazy characters, tons of super far out musicians. And, we can talk about it as like a cool development of like downtown post jazz, blah, 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 blah. But on another level, I think it's just as powerful, maybe even more in some ways, to really begin to take advantage of those opportunities to sort of find your fluidity, find your trust in the pattern within these kinds of noisy environments. So there I am, big loop back, listening to the playa and kind of taking it in and seeing the way that this sense of composition could emerge from such a chaotic sonic environment. And that in a way to me is some of the best moments at Burning Man, were moments of just high chaos, where so much too much was happening inside my mind, but mostly outside. Too many people, too much stimulation, too many narratives, too many archetypes, too many feelings, and hitting this kind of crescendo that becomes magical in a way. And I use that term very intentionally, because that's one way of actually thinking about what happens in like magical practice. Like if you're doing ceremonial magic, you're setting up all these associations and all these symbols, and the ritual that you're doing is kind of activating all these different levels. And it's not just the quality of the incense and the fact you're using that it's resting on a copper plate, and then there's a certain kind of flower and you're doing it at a certain kind. It's like all of those things are they're calling it together, all of these symbols, and you can stack more and more and more symbolic registers till it becomes this kind of excess of symbolic activity, and it creates a kind of altered state just through that sort of hyper reference. And there's something like that happens in these kind of chaotic environments of Burning Man. And I think that for me anyway, partly because I'm a big music fan, or I'm a very audio oriented person, that doing this in the space of sound is particularly clear and particularly rewarding. And that's kind of what I want to try to play with. Not so much this ambient field thing, because it really depends on what sonic environment we're all in. And some of us are in fairly quiet environments, so there's just a little bit of street noise. And I'm not saying, oh yeah, put on a lot of crazy music and whatever. That's sort of different. But I do want to kind of play with sound as a way of kind of allowing that sort of deeper hum or that deeper pattern to emerge sort of in between the sounds. And a couple of points, and then we can explore. One is that our language gives us something really nice, which is it gives us a difference between hearing and listening. So, did you hear that? That's what we would say. You wouldn't go, did you listen to that? No, because listening involves intentionality. Hearing is just is more passive, although it's not quite the right word. But listening is definitely a directed attentional effect. It's like focusing in visual language. But I think visuals are actually harder to key into this difference in a way that sound provides. And so one thing that's interesting about listening to music, particularly difficult music, is you start to really see the difference between listening and hearing. And you can kind of like go back and forth. Here's another example of that. Like if you listen to super dense West African polyrhythmic music, like, traditional recordings in the village, just a bunch of drums going on. It's like, it's hard to find the thread because it's so dense with music, with rhythmic motifs, and there's not a single organizing beat like there is in most Western music. There's multiple rhythmic forms that are stacked across each other in ways that keep changing the overall rhythmic texture of the music. So one of the ways to listen to it is you key into a particular drum, not one of the drums that's improvising, but one of the kind of pattern making drums. And you just key into it and you like follow it and you start to, okay, I got that one. Okay, great. And then from that, you begin to kind of see how the different elements of the music are stacked. So that's an example of how you can listen in. And same thing with symphonic music. You're listening to something, you can't really figure it out. It's not touching you. You're like, whatever. You just go, I'm just going to track the fucking violins. And you track the violins and it gives you a way into all the other things that are kind of happening. So that's like the way that listening is very sort of directed. And then there's just the invitation to just hear, to just open the audio channel as much as you can and to not focus, to allow it to be in a sense around and for everything to be just where it is and not to stand out. And again, that was what the playa offered. You put yourself out there and it was literally like, 180 degrees or at least like 100 degrees around you, 120 degrees of all of these different sound sources. And our brains are pretty good at locating or inventing, really constructing the location of sounds, through our stereo modeling of the world. And so you can really kind of begin to immerse yourself in sound as an event that you're not trying to focus in on or organize. And so the tension between listening and hearing is a really powerful one to kind of play with, particularly as it sort of, there are different qualities of the self that are doing those things or not doing them, if you want to think about it that way. And that in sitting with sound, that playing on the edge of listening and hearing is a way to, sort of deepen the experience. So that, we'll be doing a little bit of that. And then the other element that I want to introduce, and usually I just do this in the meditation, but just for shits and giggles, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. I'm going to kind of like articulate an abstract concept of sort of not so much what we're going to do directly, but a way maybe of thinking about it, which is that the idea of inside and outside, that there are things inside and that there are things outside, that there are sounds that are inside, tinnitus, the sound of my throat, my breath inside, and that there are sounds outside. That idea is just an idea. It's a really powerful one. It's very useful, helpful, understand why it's there, but it really is, you can think about it as a template, that we have a kind of ontological template that we carry around with us, that there are things that happen on the inside and there are things that happen on the outside. And one of the things one is invited to do in meditation or in forms of meditation, certainly as you move towards the non-dual, is to dissolve that template and to be in sound where there really is no inside and no outside. And with sound, it kind of makes sense in a way that's harder with, I think, with vision. Is where does it happen? Is it in my brain? Blah, blah, blah. Because we already have a natural sense of sounds that are on the inside and sounds that are on the outside. So, and in this way, I think it's actually not a bad thing to have an abstract description of kind of one of the, aims of the meditation, which is just to become aware. Don't do anything. Don't make it go away. Don't deconstruct it, attack it necessarily. But first, just to become aware of, oh, I have a template. That template is organizing the sounds between inside and out. And that we're kind of playing with sort of feeling our way into that template and maybe softening it or dissolving it somewhat. So whether or not that's a helpful setup, and I might even end up going in a slightly different direction, but let's try sitting for a bit here. Feel free to turn off your cameras. It usually makes folks feel a little mellower, and find your seat. As always, if you're sitting in a chair, try not to lean against it too much. You really want your spine to be supporting your body. Um, and then begin to breathe. Of course, you're already breathing. So you're really just bringing breathing in to your awareness. And I can direct you to certain parts of your body, but what I'd like to do is suggest that you slightly tighten your throat or focus on your nasal passages and really tune into the breath as physical air moving through your body, but also as sound. So whatever way is most comfortable for you to listen to your breath. One is to sort of breathe in through your nose with some intention so you can kind of hear it in your head. Another is to constrict your throat, as we do in yoga. You get the Darth Vader vinyasa breathing. Just a little bit, just enough for you to be able to tune into it. And as you settle in, follow the breath as a movement of sound as well as the physical sensations of breath moving through your body. Again, just the subtlest thread of sound. And allow your exhale to carry away whatever tensions are standing in the way of you and presence. These might be restless sense of thinking, skittering energy, aches and pains, slight discomfort in your body posture. Feel free to move around a bit if you need to, but really the invitation is to allow that stuff to come up and then to exit with your exhale. And let's even do a nice juicy sigh. On your next exhale, just sigh. Put anything you want in it. Let's do it again. There's the vocal sigh where you're kind of engaging your vocal cords, and then there's just the sort of breathy sigh, and they both have their marvels. So let's try it one last time. You might note that it's partly the sound of the sigh that allows the sigh to function as a sigh, to let yourself relax, let it go, or even just acknowledge difficulty that isn't going away, because some of our restlessness, certainly some of our thinking, some of our aches and pains aren't necessarily going to go away right now. And that's okay. We can breathe in and through that as well. So stay with your breath. Again, both a sonic event and a physical activity. You can just focus on the sound if that works, if you can hold on to it, but it's often easier to have it be grounded in the physical form as well and kind of combine that sense of intimacy with the breath. You know, the breath is the wind inside of us. And how do we know wind? How do we know air? We know it when it moves something enough that we can hear it, unless it's blowing in our face. But even then, usually it's making some kind of sound. The invisible registers as a sound before anything else. And in tuning into the sounds around you, even the very ordinary material sounds of your body, of the traffic, the wind, the waves, the blinking electronic devices, the cat meowing, you're tuning into the invisible. You're allowing yourself to be in relation to the invisible. So as you listen to your breath, gently locate it, which doesn't mean identifying where your mind says it's happening, but tuning into the sound itself and where the sound itself puts itself in your field of listening. Allow it to be an event that you're following, even enjoying the way you might enjoy music. And here you can inquire a little bit, since this is really a kind of inquiry practice. Where is this sound? And note when the answer to that where to that question, that inquiry, is really just an abstraction, just a thought. It's in my head. Well, what's your head? Are you holding your head? Do you know where your head is exactly? So no, well, maybe that's not right. Okay, where is the sound? It's close to me. All right. That's a little more phenomenological. So play with that quality of how the question of where the breath is happening, where the sound is happening, opens up this interesting phenomena of placing things in space. What space? So as you get a sense for where this is, you can even note, is this sound inside you? Is it on the inside? That's fine if that's what comes up. Just stay with it. See if you can just stay with the sound itself and not so much put it anywhere, but allow it to land or to float or to dissolve. As you think about it, where are you hearing the breath? Is it where the breath is, or is it in your ears? Well, let's say it's in your brain that you're modeling the sound somehow. You have a model in your head of the space, and you're putting the sound of the breath somewhere in that model. Okay, but is there an inside there? Isn't it all inside if it's a model in your head? Now turn to a sound outside of you. I'm going to assume that most of you have something: cars, traffic noise, a hum, open window, cat purring, something outside your body. Do the same thing. Where is it? Notice that the more you tune into the sound as an event, the less clear exactly its location. You might notice, oh, it's still from there, kind of maybe the direction of the window or the outside, the apartment, or where the cat is. But as you attend to it as an event occurring in your awake awareness, perhaps you will sense a slight softening of this concrete model of the room you're in, of the body you're in. So stay with that outside sound for a while. And again, notice the question of where it is and how that question brings up a model, a sense of how the room is, a sense of the world outside, and just sit with that model as something your consciousness is doing in real time, not as a thing out there, but whether you think of it as your brain creating some kind of running a virtual model, or whether you approach it from a consciousness subjective perspective, the whole template within which the sound is locating itself is just another happening. So attend to the way that the question, where is the sound, shows you, gives you a taste, a sort of intuitive sense of your model of the world. It's as if the sounds are performing the model before your eyes. But I'd like you to concentrate on one particular feature of this model, which is the boundary between inside and outside. So, in your own time and following your own flow with your own intuitive sense of when to hear and when to listen, move between your breath, your inside breath, and the outside sounds, supposedly, and see where the distinction between these actually lie. Where do you locate that distinction? Can I really find that? Again, this is a kind of inquiry process with your own experience. How does the traffic sound layer on top of your breath, or perhaps your heart beating if you're getting really quiet? Are they one thing? They two things? Where are they happening? Aren't they happening in one space, the space of sound? How can I divide that up? It's all happening in my head, or it's all just happening. And as you do this kind of work, pay attention to your feelings. Pay attention to the quality of your awareness, because there will be moments when well, this is kind of an artificial exercise. And there will be many moments when you're like, yeah, my breath's inside and the traffic's outside. That's not shifting, however much I look at it. But there may also be moments when there's a ambiguity, or a sense of dissolution, or a sense of presence, where the presence of the traffic and the presence of the breath are exactly the same, and in being exactly the same, change the situation briefly. So part of what you're also doing is tuning into those moments and just being able to recognize them. You can't necessarily stay there. You can't do anything with it. Probably shouldn't even try. But just be attentive to these subtle openings that can happen through this kind of practice. So I'll shut up for a little while so you can listen and hear. Notice it as well, what happens as you attend to sound, allowing the template to dissolve or fade, that the words that you assign to the sounds, while they might still arise, also lose their solidity. So it is less like you are hearing a truck and more like a truck event is massaging my ears, or I am tasting the cat's purr, a purr that is really a resonance, a rumble, an ohm. Allow yourself to listen beneath the words, beneath even the location in space. Where is this happening? When the template dissolves, when the sense of inside and outside becomes unclear or begins to disappear, and just rest. Don't make a new model if you can help it. Don't think about it. Just rest in the enjoyment of sound unfolding, neither inside nor outside, neither here nor there. If one of the sounds is something you particularly love or find irritating, you may have noticed that those feelings have shifted, perhaps opened up. It's fine if they haven't. Aggravating sounds are aggravating, sometimes quite deeply. And yet there's still a spaciousness in approaching them this way. And rest in that spaciousness. And finally, I want to gesture to a sound that you may or may not hear. In some meditation texts, it's called the sound of silence. It's easier to pick up if there's not a lot going on. But once you hear it, you can hear it even in the midst of very loud noise. It's kind of like a ringing in your ears, but much subtler, closer to awareness, if you will. Not so much happening out there or even in the out there that is in here, like where your breath or your heartbeat can be sensed or heard. It's something much closer to the seat, the effulgent awareness itself. And again, it's a kind of steady, very light hiss, perhaps. And I'll just gesture to that, see what comes up. Well, I feel like sighing some more, so let's wrap this up with three more nice sighs. So take all those sounds, all that energy, and in an exhale, just let it go. And whatever kind of sigh works for you. And with this sound, we will end.